Tuesday morning arrived gray and cool, with a light drizzle settling over the town before the sun had a chance to break through the clouds. I hadn't been back to the post office since my retirement party almost 7 years earlier. Driving there felt strangely familiar, as though my hands already knew every turn before I made it. Some places become part of you after enough years, and no amount of time can completely erase them. The regional processing center sat behind the newer post office building, a plain brick warehouse that most people drove past without ever noticing. It wasn't where customers bought stamps or mailed packages. This was where old equipment, forgotten records, decades of paperwork ended up before eventually being destroyed. I had spent countless afternoons walking through those storage rooms searching for misplaced route maps or delivery logs. Back then, I knew every shelf by memory. Evelyn Collins was already waiting outside when I pulled into the parking lot. She looked almost exactly as I remembered her, though retirement had replaced her neatly pressed uniforms with blue jeans and a windbreaker. Her silver hair was a little shorter now, but she still carried herself with the same calm confidence that had earned everyone's respect during her years as station manager. "There he is," she called with a smile as I climbed out of the truck. "I was beginning to think you decided sleeping in was more appealing." "I've never learned how," I said, shaking her hand before she pulled me into a quick hug. "You look well." "So do you," she laughed. "You're getting better at lying in retirement." I learned from the best. For a moment, it felt as though no time had passed at all. Inside, the warehouse smelled exactly as I remembered. Cardboard, old paper, machine oil, and dust. Some people might have wrinkled their noses, but to me it smelled like nearly half a lifetime of honest work. Rows of tall metal shelving stretched across the building, filled with faded boxes marked by year, route number, or department. Forklifts moved slowly in the distance, while two younger employees sorted pallets near the loading dock. Evelyn handed me a pair of work gloves. "We've got about 60 boxes left to review before the shredding company comes next week." "Only 60? I smiled. I knew you'd appreciate that. They had arranged several boxes on folding tables in a small work area near the back wall. Most contained exactly what you'd expect: old maintenance records, outdated employee schedules, equipment inventories, and stacks of forms that had long since lost any practical value. We worked side by side for nearly an hour, occasionally stopping to laugh over names we remembered or mistakes we'd both forgotten until that moment. "You remember Carl Simmons?" Evelyn asked while flipping through a binder. "The carrier who locked his keys inside his own mail truck?" She grinned. "3 times. I told him after the second time to keep a spare key in his wallet. He locked that inside too." We both laughed harder than the story probably deserved. Retirement has a way of making old frustrations sound like treasured memories. As the morning wore on, the conversation drifted naturally toward our families. "How's Michael doing?" Evelyn asked. "Busy, I suppose. And your granddaughter?" The question lingered between us. "I saw her last weekend." "Oh, it had been a long time." Evelyn looked at me carefully but didn't pry. "I'm glad you finally got to see her. So am I." The words were true, though they carried more weight than she could have known. Just before lunch, one of the younger employees wheeled over another cart stacked with boxes. "These came from the old Route 7 archive," he said. "Nobody knows why they weren't destroyed years ago." Route 7. That had been my route during the last 12 years before retirement. I glanced at Evelyn. "Looks like somebody saved my mess." She smiled. "Or your organization." The first few boxes contained exactly what their labels suggested: signed delivery confirmations, change of address requests, holiday staffing schedules. Everything was neatly bundled with aging rubber bands that snapped apart the moment I touched them. Then I noticed something odd. One box carried no label at all. Its cardboard had yellowed more than the others, and unlike the rest, it had been sealed with heavy brown packing tape across every edge. "That's strange," I said. Evelyn looked over. "I don't remember seeing that one before." The box was surprisingly heavy. I slid it toward the center of the table and carefully cut through the old tape with a utility knife. Dust drifted into the air as I lifted the flaps. Inside were dozens of bundled envelopes, not official postal records, personal mail. Every bundle had been tied neatly with cotton string. "That shouldn't be here," Evelyn murmured. "No, personal mail was never stored like this." Undeliverable letters followed strict procedures. Lost mail had its own department. Everything had a place, and this wasn't it. I picked up the first bundle. Most of the envelopes were yellowed with age. Some had faded stamps. Others carried forwarding labels. Then one envelope near the middle caught my attention, my own handwriting. I froze. For a second, I honestly wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me. Slowly, I pulled the envelope free. Across the front, written in the careful block letters I had used for decades, were words I recognized immediately. Miss Olivia Bennett. My heart began pounding so loudly, I barely heard Evelyn ask what was wrong. I turned the envelope over. The return address was mine, my house. The postmark was dated almost 14 years earlier. I stared at it in complete disbelief. I mailed this, I whispered. Evelyn frowned. What? I remember this letter. I remembered because it had been Olivia's second birthday after Helen was diagnosed. I'd included a photograph of Helen holding the birthday cake we'd baked together. Helen insisted Olivia would treasure that picture someday. With trembling hands, I looked back inside the box. Another envelope, same handwriting, another, and another. Every single one addressed to Olivia. Every single one carrying my return address, some birthday cards, some Christmas letters, some ordinary envelopes I'd written just because I missed her. I stopped counting after 20. Evelyn's face had gone completely pale. Arthur, I mailed every one of these. I know you did. They were never delivered. Lie. She carefully picked up one envelope, studying the markings. They've never even been opened. The room suddenly felt much quieter than it had a moment earlier. Somewhere across the warehouse, a forklift backed up with its warning alarm beeping steadily, but it sounded distant, almost unreal. 15 years. 15 years of wondering why Olivia had never answered. 15 years of believing maybe she'd forgotten me. And here, sitting inside a forgotten storage box, were years of my life that had never reached her. I swallowed hard. This isn't possible. Evelyn wasn't looking at the letters anymore. She was looking at the back of the box. Arthur, what? Lie. She pointed toward a faded inventory tag that had nearly fallen off the cardboard. Someone had written a date, a storage authorization number, and beneath it, a signature. I leaned closer, my pulse racing. The ink had faded with time, but one name was still barely readable. Not Rachel, not Michael, someone else. Someone whose name I recognized instantly and whose connection to my family made even less sense than the letters themselves. I turned the envelope over twice before opening it. Old habits die hard when you've spent most of your life handling other people's mail. You notice the weight of the paper, the quality of the envelope, even the way someone presses a pen against the page. Whoever had addressed this knew how to write with care. There was something almost familiar about that. Though I couldn't place why, I slid the letter opener beneath the flap, as gently as if I were opening something that might fall apart in my hands. Why? Inside was a cream-colored invitation with tiny blue flowers printed around the border. It wasn't flashy or expensive, just simple and elegant. My eyes moved straight to the center of the card, and for a moment, I forgot to breathe. You are warmly invited to celebrate the 16th birthday of Olivia Bennett. I read her name 3 times before I could believe it was real. Then I noticed the date. It was only 9 days away. I lowered myself into the kitchen chair because my knees suddenly didn't feel as steady as they had a moment earlier. 16. The little girl who used to ask me why the moon followed our car at night was turning 16. I smiled before I even realized I was smiling. It felt strange, almost unfamiliar, like using a muscle that had been asleep for years. I read every line of the invitation again, searching for some mistake that would explain why it had arrived in my mailbox after all this time. There wasn't one. The celebration would be held at Michael's house on Saturday afternoon. Friends and family were invited. Dinner would follow in the backyard if the weather cooperated. There was even a small handwritten note tucked beneath the printed message. We hope you can make it. That single sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. It wasn't signed. Lie. There was no way to know who had written it. Maybe Michael had added it at the last minute. Maybe Olivia herself had insisted. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to wonder if she had been asking about me all along. Hope has a funny way of ignoring logic. It doesn't care how many disappointments came before. Give it the smallest opening, and it rushes back in like it never left. I carried the invitation into the living room and placed it beside Helen's photograph on the mantel. She was smiling in that picture, the same gentle smile that had made strangers feel like old friends. Looks like I finally got invited, I said quietly, feeling a little foolish for talking out loud. I had done it often since she passed away. It wasn't because I believed she could answer. It was because saying things aloud somehow made the empty house feel less empty. That evening, I pulled the unfinished jewelry box down from the workshop shelf. Fine dust had settled across the smooth cherry wood, so I wiped it away with a soft cloth before running my fingers over the lid. I had carved a tiny wildflower into one corner because Olivia used to fill her pockets with flowers every spring, even if they were nothing more than dandelions. She would line them up across my porch steps and proudly announce she had opened her own flower shop. Helen always bought the first bouquet for a nickel. I spent the next several hours finishing the inside of the box. I cut the deep blue velvet carefully, making sure every corner fit perfectly. Then I polished the wood until it reflected the workshop lights. When I finally closed the lid, it made that soft click only well-built hinges can make. It wasn't an expensive gift. A teenager could probably buy something fancier at a shopping mall without thinking twice. But every inch of it had passed through my own hands, and somehow that mattered more to me than anything money could purchase. The following morning, I drove into town to look for something to place inside it. Jewelry seemed too personal, especially after so many years apart. I wandered through 3 different stores before finding a delicate silver compass charm on a simple chain. The young woman behind the counter asked if it was for someone special. My granddaughter, I answered. She smiled. 16th birthday? I looked at her in surprise. Just a lucky guess, she laughed. I smiled back, but my thoughts stayed somewhere else. Maybe it really was luck. Or maybe grandfathers all wore the same hopeful expression when they shopped for girls they hadn't seen nearly enough. Back home, I placed the necklace inside the jewelry box and closed the lid one last time. The gift looked complete now, but I wasn't sure I was. I walked into the bedroom and stood in front of my closet longer than I cared to admit. Most of my clothes hadn't changed in years. Retirement has a way of making comfort more important than fashion. Still, this wasn't an ordinary afternoon. I wanted to look like the grandfather Olivia deserved to remember. I chose the navy sport coat Helen always said brought out the blue in my eyes. The sleeves felt a little tighter than I remembered. I made a mental note that I should probably stop accepting homemade pies from my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. She insisted baking was cheaper than therapy, and after tasting her apple pie, I wasn't about to argue with her. On Thursday afternoon, she noticed me trimming the hedge along the front walk. "You're smiling more than usual," she called from across the fence. "Am I? You certainly are. Something good happened." I hesitated before answering. "I got invited to my granddaughter's birthday." Her face brightened immediately.
"Well, Arthur, it's about time. It is."
She rested her gardening gloves on the fence and looked at me for a moment. "You nervous?" I laughed softly, more than I'd like to admit. "You'll do fine. I hope she remembers me." Mrs. Henderson didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer and gently touched my arm. Children remember more love than adults realize. I thanked her, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. Memory can be a strange thing. Sometimes it preserves tiny moments forever, and sometimes it quietly erases the people who once meant everything. That night, I placed the wrapped jewelry box beside my front door so I wouldn't forget it on Saturday morning. Before heading to bed, I looked once more at the invitation resting on the mantel. Something about it continued to bother me, though I couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the unfamiliar handwriting on the envelope, or the fact that after 15 silent years, everything seemed to change with a single piece of paper. I told myself I was overthinking it. After all, not every surprise hides a problem. But as I turned off the lights and the house settled into its familiar silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that this invitation carried more than an address and a date. Somewhere beneath its polite words was a story I didn't yet understand, and in just a few days, I was finally going to step inside it. Saturday arrived with the kind of weather Helen would have called a gift from God. The sky was clear, the air was cool without being cold, and the maple trees along my street were just beginning to show the first hints of spring green. I woke before dawn, even earlier than usual, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling while a nervous energy moved through me like electricity. At 69 years old, I felt absurdly similar to the way I had felt before my first date with Helen. I finally gave up on sleep and got dressed slowly, taking more care than I normally would. I shaved twice to make sure I hadn't missed a spot, polished my shoes, and pressed my tie even though I almost never wore one anymore. The navy sport coat fit well enough, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw an old man trying very hard not look like an old man. For a moment, I almost changed back into something more comfortable. Then I thought of Olivia opening the jewelry box, and I left the coat on. Before leaving, I stood in front of Helen's photograph again. Wish me luck. The drive across town took only 20 minutes, but it felt much longer. Every familiar street carried some memory of Michael growing up. The park where I taught him to ride a bicycle. The diner where we used to eat pancakes after Little League games. The hardware store where he once spent an hour choosing nails for a birdhouse that leaned so badly it looked ready to surrender to gravity. I realized, with a sudden ache, how many memories existed before everything became complicated. As I turned into Michael's neighborhood, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. His house was larger than the one he grew up in, with a wide front porch and a backyard that backed onto a small line of trees. Cars were already parked along both sides of the street. Balloons were tied to the mailbox, and I could see people moving through the backyard carrying trays of food and folding chairs. I sat in the car for a full minute before getting out. The wrapped jewelry box felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked up the driveway. Laughter drifted from the backyard, mixed with music I didn't recognize. For a brief moment, hope rose in me again. Maybe this was exactly what it appeared to be. Maybe families really could find their way back to each other without dramatic speeches or painful explanations. I knocked even though the front door was already open. Rachel appeared first. She looked surprised to see me, and the expression crossed her face quickly enough that someone else might have missed it. I didn't. In all the years I'd known her, Rachel had always been good at arranging her emotions before anyone could study them too closely. "Arthur," she said, recovering almost immediately. "You made it. Wouldn't miss my granddaughter's 16th birthday. Of course. Come in." Her smile was polite, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I told myself I was imagining things. The living room was filled with people I only half recognized. Relatives from Rachel's side of the family, a few of Michael's coworkers. Conversations continued as I entered, though I noticed several people glanced toward me and then quickly away. That feeling of arriving late to a conversation that had already been happening settled over me almost at once. Michael came through the hallway carrying a tray of drinks. He stopped when he saw me. "Dad, glad you could come." He set the tray down and gave me a brief hug. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't the kind of hug a son gives when he's truly happy to see his father either. There was hesitation in it, as if he were checking how much closeness was expected. "You look good," I said. "Thanks. You too." For a second, we simply looked at each other, both of us seeming unsure what came next. "Olivia's in the backyard with her friends," he said finally. "I'll get her." I nodded and handed him the gift. "Could you make sure this gets to her?" "Sure." He took the box carefully, and I felt an unexpected relief watching it leave my hands. At least that part was done. While he disappeared toward the kitchen, I stood awkwardly near the doorway, pretending to study the framed photographs on the wall. Most of them were of Olivia growing up, school pictures, soccer uniforms, vacations I had never known about. I found myself searching the frames for any photograph that included me. There wasn't one. I turned to see my sister Carol approaching with genuine warmth on her face. She hugged me tightly. "I was hoping you'd come." "So was I." She pulled back and studied me. "How are you doing? Better now that I'm here." Carol's smile softened, but something flickered in her eyes that I couldn't read. "Have you seen Olivia yet?" "Not yet." "She's beautiful, Arthur. You won't believe how grown up she is." Before I could answer, a burst of laughter came from the backyard, and everyone nearby seemed to turn toward it. I followed their gaze. Olivia was walking toward the house, surrounded by 3 teenage girls. She wore a pale blue dress, and for a moment the years fell away so suddenly that my chest tightened. She had Helen's smile. I had forgotten that. Not just a similar smile, the same smile appearing slowly and then all at once, as if happiness needed a second to fully arrive. Michael said something to her and gestured in my direction. She looked at me for one suspended heartbeat. I expected recognition to bloom across her face, followed by surprise, then maybe even happiness. Instead, I saw uncertainty. Not the uncertainty of someone overwhelmed by emotion, but the uncertainty of someone trying to identify a person she had met only a few times. She walked over politely. "Hi, Grandpa." Her voice was warm enough, but careful. Formal. "Happy birthday, Olivia." "Thank you for coming." I waited for her to say something else, anything else. A memory, a question, a sign that the distance between us was smaller than I feared. Nothing came. "You look so much like your grandmother," I said. She smiled politely again. "People tell me that." One of her friends called her name from the backyard. "I should get back to everyone," she said. "But thank you for being here." And then she was gone. I stood there holding a smile that no longer had anywhere to go. The room around me continued buzzing with conversation, but it sounded slightly muffled, as if I were hearing it through water. I told myself not to be unfair. She was 16. She barely knew me. Lie. None of this was her fault. Yet one question kept pressing against my thoughts. If I had written to her all these years, if I had remembered every birthday and every Christmas, how had we become strangers standing 3 feet apart? I stayed where I was for another minute, watching Olivia disappear into the crowd of teenagers laughing near the patio. She fit naturally among them, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. That should have made me happy. Part of me was. But another part couldn't ignore the feeling that I had just met my own granddaughter for the first time, instead of seeing a child I had loved since the day she was born. I wandered toward the backyard, accepting a glass of iced tea from a neighbor I barely recognized. The yard had been decorated with strings of white lights, even though the sun was still high in the sky. Long folding tables were covered with blue tablecloth, and someone had gone to great effort arranging flowers in small mason jars. Michael had always been good at building things, but decorating had never been his strength. I smiled to myself, knowing Rachel had probably planned every detail weeks in advance. Arthur, I turned to see my cousin Frank making his way across the lawn. We hadn't seen each other since Helen's funeral. He wrapped me in a hug that smelled faintly of sawdust and aftershave. It's been too long, he said. It has. He stepped back and looked around before lowering his voice. I'm glad you came. So am I. The words caught me off guard. I wasn't invited. Frank frowned, almost as though he thought he'd misheard me. You weren't? Lie. I shook my head. For a second, he looked genuinely confused, but before he could say anything else, his wife called him over to help move another table. He hesitated, glanced back at me, then forced a smile. We'll catch up later. I watched him walk away, replaying those few seconds in my head. His surprise hadn't seemed rehearsed. It looked real. I tried to brush it aside, telling myself families often misunderstand one another. Still, a small question settled into the back of my mind. Had everyone assumed I simply chose not to come? Before I could think any further, Michael appeared beside me. Everything okay? Of course. You've been standing here by yourself. I don't mind. He nodded, but his eyes drifted around the yard instead of meeting mine. It reminded me of the way he used to act as a teenager whenever he was hiding a bad report card. You've done a nice job with the place, I said. Rachel deserves most of the credit. I'm sure. An awkward silence followed. I've been meaning to call more often, he finally said. You could have. I know. Neither of us seemed willing to take that conversation any further. It wasn't anger keeping us apart anymore. It was habit. 15 years of careful conversations had taught us both how to avoid subjects that might hurt. Someone announced that lunch was ready, and people began lining up beside the buffet tables. Michael excused himself to help serve drinks. I found an empty chair near the edge of the yard where I could watch without getting in anyone's way. From there, I noticed little things. Olivia greeted nearly every guest with a hug. She laughed easily with Rachel's relatives. She posed for photographs with friends. But every time her eyes passed over me, she offered the same polite smile reserved for distant acquaintances. Not cold, not unkind, just unfamiliar that hurt more than open rejection ever could. As people settled into their seats, I overheard two older women talking behind me. I didn't think he'd actually come. I almost feel bad for him. Well, at least Rachel invited him. They lowered their voices before I could hear the rest invited him. The phrase echoed strangely in my thoughts. Why wouldn't she? I tried to ignore it. Lunch passed with small conversations about weather, retirement, grandchildren, and rising grocery prices. I answered when spoken to, smiled when appropriate, and listened far more than I talked. Every now and then I'd catch Olivia across the yard, surrounded by people her own age. Once our eyes met for just a second. I lifted my hand in a small wave. She waved back. Then she turned as one of her friends called her name. I reminded myself that 16-year-olds belonged with other 16-year-olds, not sitting beside old men telling stories about the past. Still legal. I couldn't stop wishing for 5 uninterrupted minutes alone with her, just enough time to ask how school was going, just enough time to hear about her dreams, just enough time to learn what kind of young woman she had become. After lunch, guests began gathering near the patio, where the birthday cake had been placed on a decorated table. I stayed toward the back, not wanting to crowd the family photographs. As everyone laughed and shifted into position, I noticed Rachel speaking quietly with one of her friends only a few feet away. They hadn't realized I was close enough to hear them over the music. I almost told Michael not to send it, Rachel whispered. Her friend looked surprised. Then why did you? Rachel gave a small shrug. People would have asked questions if Arthur wasn't here. Her friend nodded slowly. I suppose that's true. And this way, Rachel continued, glancing briefly across the yard, everyone sees we included him. The words landed harder than I expected. Included him, not wanted him here. Included him. Like checking a box on a list, I looked toward Michael instinctively, wondering if he'd heard any of it. He was helping Olivia straighten the candles on the cake, completely unaware. A tightness settled in my chest. Suddenly, the invitation on my mantle at home didn't feel like an olive branch anymore. It felt like evidence. For several long moments, I stood perfectly still, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood. Maybe Rachel meant something else. Maybe there was context I hadn't heard. But deep down, I knew exactly what she had meant. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the empty space where the jewelry box had been earlier that afternoon. At least Olivia would still receive it. That thought offered a small comfort. Without drawing attention to myself, I quietly stepped away from the crowd. No one stopped me. No one called my name. Why? The laughter around the birthday cake grew louder as I crossed the living room and opened the front door. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful. A light breeze carried the distant sound of children playing somewhere down the street. I reached my car, rested one hand on the roof for a moment, and looked back at the house. Through the backyard fence, I could hear everyone singing happy birthday. I closed my eyes. I hope you're happy, sweetheart, I whispered. Then, I climbed into my car and drove home before anyone noticed I was gone. What I didn't know was that my quiet departure had not gone completely unseen. From an upstairs bedroom window, someone had watched me leave. And before the birthday candles had even burned out, that person made a decision that would change everything. The drive home felt longer than it had that morning. I kept the radio off, letting the quiet fill the car instead. Every traffic light seemed to last a little too long, giving my mind more time to replay the afternoon. Olivia's polite smile, Michael's careful words, Rachel's whisper. By the time I turned onto my street, I wasn't angry. I was simply tired in a way that sleep could never fix. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly as I had left it a few hours earlier. The porch swing moved gently in the breeze, and Helen's wind chimes tapped softly against one another. Usually that sound brought me comfort. Today it only reminded me how empty the place had become. I unlocked the front door, my coat on the same hook it had occupied for years, and stood in the hallway without knowing what to do next. I wandered into the kitchen and noticed the invitation still lying on the table where I had left it after checking the address one final time that morning. I picked it up again, turning it over in my hands. Nothing about it had changed. The paper still felt expensive, the handwriting still looked careful, and the simple note, "We hope you can make it," still seemed sincere. Yet those words carried a completely different weight now. I wondered who had actually written them, and whether they had meant every letter or none of them. I poured myself a cup of coffee, even though it was late in the afternoon. Helen used to tease me for drinking coffee at any hour of the day, insisting it would keep me awake all night. She was usually right. As I stood by the kitchen window, I caught myself imagining what I would have told her if she had been standing beside me. She was beautiful, I would have said, and she didn't know me. Why? Helen would have understood the silence that followed. She always knew when words had reached their limit. I carried my coffee into the living room and lowered myself into my favorite chair. Across the room sat the empty space where the wrapped jewelry box had rested for days before the party. I smiled faintly, hoping Olivia would eventually open it. Maybe she'd notice the carved wildflower on the lid. Maybe someone would tell her why I chose it. Maybe she'd never know. At least it belonged to her now. Just after 6 o'clock, the telephone rang. Hardly anyone called anymore, so the sound startled me. I glanced at the caller ID before answering. It was Carol. "Hello? Arthur?" she asked, sounding slightly out of breath. "I'm here. Did you get home all right?" "I did." There was a pause. "You left pretty early." "I didn't want to get in the way." "You weren't in the way." "I think I was." Carol sighed softly. "People noticed you were gone." "Well, I doubt. It took them long." Olivia did. Those 3 words made me sit a little straighter. She asked where you went. "What did you tell her?" I said, "Maybe you weren't feeling well." I stared at the floor. That wasn't exactly a lie. Carol hesitated again, choosing her next words carefully. She seemed disappointed. I wanted to believe that. More than anything, I wanted to believe it. But hope had fooled me once already that day. "She's a kind girl," I replied. "She probably would have been disappointed if any guest left early." "I don't think that's all it was." Before I could ask what she meant, Carol changed the subject. Did she like your gift? I don't know. They hadn't opened presents yet. Oh, another silence settled between us. Arthur, Carol said quietly, have you ever wondered why everything changed so suddenly all those years ago? The question caught me completely off guard. Every single day I figured, do you know something I don't? She stopped herself. No, not really. Her answer came too quickly to sound convincing. If you know something, Carol, tell me. I can't or won't. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she said, just promise me one thing. What's that? Don't throw anything away. Not your letters, not your photographs. Nothing my letters? Yes. I frowned. I've kept every copy I ever wrote. Good. Why does that matter? I don't know if it does. Her voice softened. Maybe someday it will. Before I could ask another question, she excused herself, saying guests were beginning to leave and she'd call me in a few days. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the receiver with far more questions than answers. Why would she ask about my letters? She didn't even know I'd kept copies. Years ago, Helen had convinced me to buy a small carbon copy notebook after I complained about forgetting what I'd written to family members. It became a habit. Every letter I mailed to Olivia existed twice, once inside an envelope and once in my old notebook tucked safely inside my desk drawer. I hadn't looked through those pages in years. That evening, I opened the drawer and carefully lifted the worn notebook into my hands. The cover had faded with age, but inside, every page remained intact. Birthday wishes, Christmas memories, stories about neighborhood children, little updates about my garden. Advice I hoped she'd someday find useful. Reading them now felt like listening to a younger version of myself who never stopped believing the next letter might finally receive a reply. I closed the notebook gently and returned it to the drawer. Whatever had happened between Olivia and me, I had done everything I knew to keep the connection alive. That much, at least, I was certain of. Monday morning arrived with another familiar routine. Coffee, sunrise. The newspaper left at the end of the driveway. I had just settled into my chair when my cell phone buzzed across the kitchen counter. The screen displayed a name I hadn't expected to see, Mrs. Evelyn Collins, my former post office manager. I hadn't spoken to Evelyn in almost 3 years. Curious, I answered. Arthur Bennett speaking. Arthur, it's Evelyn Collins. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Not at all. How have you been? Oh, still trying to convince myself retirement is relaxing, she laughed. Listen, I know this is short notice, but I'm helping the regional office clear out an old storage archive tomorrow. There are a few boxes from our station that nobody can identify anymore. I remembered how particular you always were about old records. I thought you might enjoy helping me sort through them before everything gets shredded. I smiled. You still remember I hated throwing away paperwork. You practically treated every envelope like it had feelings. I probably did. She laughed again. So, can you come? I looked toward the desk where my old notebook rested quietly inside the drawer. Yes, I said. I think I'd like that. Neither of us could have imagined that hidden among those forgotten storage boxes was the first piece of evidence that would finally answer the question I had been asking myself for 15 long years. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cool, with a light drizzle settling over the town before the sun had a chance to break through the clouds. I hadn't been back to the post office since my retirement party almost 7 years earlier. Driving there felt strangely familiar, as though my hands already knew every turn before I made it. Some places become part of you after enough years, and no amount of time can completely erase them. The regional processing center sat behind the newer post office building, a plain brick warehouse that most people drove past without ever noticing. It wasn't where customers bought stamps or mailed packages. This was where old equipment, forgotten records, decades of paperwork ended up before eventually being destroyed. I had spent countless afternoons walking through those storage rooms, searching for misplaced route maps or delivery logs. Back then, I knew every shelf by memory. Evelyn Collins was already waiting outside when I pulled into the parking lot. She looked almost exactly as I remembered her, though retirement had replaced her neatly pressed uniforms with blue jeans and a windbreaker. Her silver hair was a little shorter now, but she still carried herself with the same calm confidence that had earned everyone's respect during her years as station manager. There he is, she called with a smile as I climbed out of the truck. I was beginning to think you'd decided sleeping in was more appealing. I've never learned how, I said, shaking her hand before she pulled me into a quick hug. You look well. So do you, she laughed. You're getting better at lying in retirement. I learned from the best. For a moment, it felt as though no time had passed at all. Inside, the warehouse smelled exactly as I remembered. Cardboard, old paper, machine oil, and dust. Some people might have wrinkled their noses, but to me it smelled like nearly half a lifetime of honest work. Rows of tall metal shelving stretched across the building, filled with faded boxes marked by year, route number, or department. Forklifts moved slowly in the distance. While two younger employees sorted pallets near the loading dock, Evelyn handed me a pair of work gloves. We've got about 60 boxes left to review before the shredding company comes next week. Only 60? I smiled. I knew you'd appreciate that. They had arranged several boxes on folding tables in a small work area near the back wall. Most contained exactly what you'd expect. Old maintenance records, outdated employee schedules, equipment inventories, and stacks of forms that had long since lost any practical value. We worked side by side for nearly an hour, occasionally stopping to laugh over names we remembered or mistakes we'd both forgotten until that moment. You remember Carl Simmons? Lie. Evelyn asked while flipping through a binder. The carrier who locked his keys inside his own mail truck? She grinned. 3 times. I told him after the second time to keep a spare key in his wallet. He locked that inside too. We both laughed harder than the story probably deserved. Retirement has a way of making old frustrations sound like treasured memories. As the morning wore on, the conversation drifted naturally toward our families. How's Michael doing? Evelyn asked. Busy, I suppose. And your granddaughter? The question lingered between us. I saw her last weekend. Oh, it had been a long time. Evelyn looked at me carefully but didn't pry. I'm glad you finally got to see her, so am I. The words were true, though they carried more weight than she could have known. Just before lunch, one of the younger employees wheeled over another cart stacked with boxes. These came from the old Route 7 archive, he said. Nobody knows why they weren't destroyed years ago. What Route 7? That had been my route during the last 12 years before retirement. I glanced at Evelyn. Looks like somebody saved my mess. She smiled. Or your organization. The first few boxes contained exactly what their labels suggested: signed delivery confirmations, change of address requests, holiday staffing schedules. Everything was neatly bundled with aging rubber bands that snapped apart the moment I touched them. Then I noticed something odd. One box carried no label at all. Its cardboard had yellowed more than the others, and unlike the rest, it had been sealed with heavy brown packing tape across every edge. That's strange, I said. Evelyn looked over. I don't remember seeing that one before. The box was surprisingly heavy. I slid it toward the center of the table and carefully cut through the old tape with a utility knife. Dust drifted into the air as I lifted the flaps. Inside were dozens of bundled envelopes, not official postal records. Personal mail, every bundle had been tied neatly with cotton string. That shouldn't be here, Evelyn murmured. No. Personal mail was never stored like this. Undeliverable letters followed strict procedures. Lost mail had its own department. Everything had a place, and this wasn't it. I picked up the first bundle. Most of the envelopes were yellowed with age. Some had faded stamps. Others carried forwarding labels. Then one envelope near the middle caught my attention. My own handwriting. I froze. For a second, I honestly wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me. Slowly, I pulled the envelope free. Across the front, written in the careful block letters I had used for decades, were words I recognized immediately. Miss Olivia Bennett. My heart began pounding so loudly I barely heard Evelyn ask what was wrong. I turned the envelope over. The return address was mine, my house. The postmark was dated almost 14 years earlier. I stared at it in complete disbelief. I mailed this, I whispered. Evelyn frowned. What? I remember this letter. I remembered because it had been Olivia's second birthday after Helen was diagnosed. I'd included a photograph of Helen holding the birthday cake we'd baked together. Helen insisted Olivia would treasure that picture someday. With trembling hands, looked back inside the box, another envelope, same handwriting, another, and another. Every single one addressed to Olivia. Every single one carrying my return address, some birthday cards, some Christmas letters, some ordinary envelopes I'd written just because I missed her. I stopped counting after 20. Evelyn's face had gone completely pale. Arthur, I mailed every one of these. I know you did. They were never delivered. Lee. She carefully picked up one envelope, studying the markings. They've never even been opened. The room suddenly felt much quieter than it had a moment earlier. Somewhere across the warehouse, a forklift backed up with its warning alarm beeping steadily, but It sounded distant, almost unreal. 15 years. 15 years of wondering why Olivia had never answered. 15 years of believing maybe she'd forgotten me. And here, sitting inside a forgotten storage box, were years of my life that had never reached her. I swallowed hard. This isn't possible. Evelyn wasn't looking at the letters anymore. She was looking at the back of the box. Arthur, what? She pointed toward a faded inventory tag that had nearly fallen off the cardboard. Someone had written a date, a storage authorization number, and beneath it, a signature. I leaned closer, my pulse racing. The ink had faded with time, but one name was still barely readable. Not Rachel, not Michael. Someone else. Someone whose name I recognized instantly, and whose connection to my family made even less sense than the letters themselves. I leaned closer until my face was only inches from the faded tag. Years of dust had settled into the cardboard, making the handwriting difficult to read. But there was no mistaking the signature once my eyes adjusted. Daniel Mercer. For a moment, the name meant nothing. Then, almost like a forgotten photograph coming back into focus, I remembered Daniel had worked in the customer service office at our local branch years ago. He wasn't a carrier. He handled forwarding requests, addressed corrections, special mail problems. Quiet fellow, less polite. We weren't close friends, but we'd shared enough coffee breaks over the years that I knew he took his job seriously. It can't be him, I said quietly. Evelyn looked just as puzzled. I don't understand why his name would be on a storage authorization. Neither do I. She gently took the box from me and examined the tag herself. Daniel retired almost 12 years ago. I know, and he passed away 3 years after that. Lie. I nodded slowly. I remembered attending his memorial service. A heart attack, if I recalled correctly. He had left behind a wife and 2 grown daughters. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. The discovery answered nothing. Instead, it created a dozen new questions. If Daniel had authorized the box, why? Why were my letters inside? Why hadn't anyone reported them? And most importantly, how had every single letter I sent to Olivia ended up here? Evelyn carefully untied another bundle. The envelopes were arranged almost perfectly in chronological order, birthday after birthday, Christmas after Christmas. One Mother's Day card I'd mailed because Olivia had once asked if she could give it to Rachel herself. Every envelope remained sealed, no torn edges, no broken flaps, no fingerprints except ours. They've never been opened, Evelyn whispered again. I can see that. She looked toward the warehouse supervisor across the room. We're going to need to document this. I don't care about documenting it. She turned back to me. I know you don't, but if we're going to find out what happened, we need to do this properly. She was right. Years in the postal service had taught me that emotions solve very little. Records solve problems. Evidence solve problems. Facts solve problems. I took a long breath and slowly nodded. What do we do first? We photograph everything exactly as we found it. Within 20 minutes, the warehouse supervisor had joined us along with another retired manager who happened to be volunteering that morning. They carefully photographed the box, the inventory tag, every bundle of letters, and the authorization slip attached to the side. Nobody seemed interested in destroying anything anymore. The mood inside the warehouse had changed completely. One of the younger employees finally asked, "Is this serious?" Evelyn answered before I could. It may be one of the most unusual things I've seen in 40 years. The young man wisely stopped asking questions. While everyone documented the discovery, I sat quietly in a folding chair, unable to take my eyes off the letters. Each envelope represented a moment of hope. The Christmas when I told Olivia about the snowman Helen and I used to build every December. The birthday when I included pressed wildflowers because she'd once insisted dandelions were prettier than roses. The letter I wrote after Helen passed away, struggling to explain loss in words gentle enough for a little girl. She had never seen any of them, not one. The realization settled over me in waves. All those years I'd wondered why my granddaughter never answered. I'd questioned whether she remembered me, whether she'd stopped caring, whether I'd somehow failed without realizing it. None of those questions had ever been fair to her. A quiet knock on the table interrupted my thoughts. It was Evelyn. I found something else. She handed me a thin manila folder tucked beneath the bottom layer of envelopes. There wasn't much inside. Why? A storage receipt, 2 routing forms, and a handwritten note attached with a rusty paperclip. The paper had yellowed badly. The handwriting wasn't Daniel's. It was smaller, more hurried. The ink had faded enough that parts were difficult to read. Together we managed to make out only fragments. Hold till request, do not process. The rest had become almost unreadable. Family request? I repeated. Evelyn frowned. That's what it looks like. But whose family? I don't know. There was no signature, no date, no explanation. Just those few surviving words. Instead of solving the mystery, the note only deepened it. A family request? My family? Rachel, someone else's? I rubbed my forehead. Love me. Nothing about the Postal Service worked this way. Nobody could simply ask employees to hold 15 years of personal mail. There were procedures, documentation, audits. Something had happened outside normal policy, something personal. The warehouse supervisor approached carrying a clipboard. Mr. Bennett, yes? We'll need to transfer everything to the Regional Investigations Office. Investigations? He nodded. Whenever mail is discovered outside authorized channels, especially personal correspondence, protocol requires an internal review. I almost laughed. After 15 years, somebody was finally going to investigate. Better late than never. As everyone continued organizing paperwork, Evelyn quietly sat beside me. Arthur, There's something I've been thinking about. What is it? She looked toward the letters before answering. Do you remember Daniel ever mentioning your family? I searched my memory. No. Did he know Michael? Not that I recall. What about Rachel? I shook my head. I don't think they ever met. She leaned back, clearly troubled. Then why would he risk his career over someone else's mail? That question stayed with me long after we left the warehouse. Before I drove home, Evelyn carefully placed every recovered letter into new evidence boxes. She wouldn't even let me touch them. I know they're yours, she said gently, but if we're going to learn the truth, they need to stay exactly as they are. I understood. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not grief. Determination. There had to be an explanation. Maybe Daniel had been following someone's instructions. Maybe someone had lied to him. Maybe the signature on that storage tag only told part of the story. As I climbed into my truck, my phone vibrated. It was Michael. He almost never called in the middle of the afternoon. I answered immediately. Dad? His voice sounded strained. Yes, Lee. I need to ask you something. What is it? There was a long silence before he finally spoke. Did someone from the post office contact you today? I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. No, I answered carefully. Why would you ask that? Another silence then, in a voice barely above a whisper. He said something that made my heart sink. Because Rachel found something in the attic this morning, and I think it's connected to you. Michael's words stayed with me during the entire drive home. Rachel found something in the attic. I think it's connected to you. He hadn't sounded angry. If anything, he sounded unsettled, almost frightened. That alone was unusual. My son had always been the steady one, the man who tried to solve problems before they became crises. Hearing uncertainty in his voice made me realize whatever Rachel had found wasn't something either of them had expected. I'll come by this evening, I told him. I think that's best. What exactly did she find? I'd rather show you. The line went quiet for a second. Dad, yes? I'm sorry. Before I could ask what he meant, the call ended. For the first time in years, I drove toward Michael's house without feeling hopeful or anxious. Those emotions had been replaced by something quieter, a determination to stop guessing. For 15 years, I'd lived on assumptions. Today, I had held proof in my hands that assumptions could steal entire chapters of a person's life. The neighborhood looked almost deserted compared to the birthday party 3 days earlier. The balloons had been taken down. The extra cars were gone. Only a few paper streamers still clung to the mailbox, fluttering lazily in the evening breeze. Michael opened the front door before I reached it. He looked exhausted. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper than I remembered, and his shirt was wrinkled as though he'd been wearing it all day. Come in. Neither of us mentioned the birthday, neither of us mentioned the phone call. He simply led me through the house toward the dining room table. Rachel was already sitting there, lucid pale. She looked pale. Between them rested a dusty cardboard box no larger than a shoebox. I appreciate you coming, she said quietly. I nodded but didn't answer. Michael gently pushed the box toward me. Rachel was cleaning out the attic this morning. We're thinking about replacing the insulation, Rachel explained. Everything had to come down. She swallowed before continuing. This was hidden behind an old air duct. The box itself wasn't remarkable. Plain brown cardboard, no labels, no tape. Just years of dust. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of photographs. Family photographs. The first showed Olivia at about 6 years old, holding a pumpkin almost too large for her arms. The second was Christmas morning. The third was a school recital. I recognized every stage of her childhood, not because I'd been there, because I'd imagined them. Beneath the photographs sat a stack of greeting cards tied together with faded blue ribbon birthday cards. Christmas cards, everyone addressed to Olivia, everyone from relatives, some from Carol, some from Frank, some from old family friends. I carefully untied the ribbon. None had been opened. My heartbeat quickened. Not just mine, everyone's. I looked up at Michael. Why were these hidden? He slowly shook his head. I don't know, Rachel wiped at her eyes. I've never seen this box before. I picked up one of the cards. The handwriting belonged to Carol. Inside, she had written a loving birthday message for Olivia's 10th birthday. The envelope had never been opened. Another from Frank, still sealed. Another from an elderly aunt who had passed away years earlier, still unopened. There were more than 40 cards, not just mine. Dozens of people had written to Olivia over the years. Many had never reached her. A cold feeling settled over the room. This doesn't make sense, Michael whispered. No, I agreed. It doesn't. Rachel leaned forward. I know what you're thinking. I met her eyes. You think I hid them. I remained silent. She lowered her head. I understand why. There was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion. I didn't even know this box existed. Michael reached inside and pulled out something folded beneath the cards. An old manila envelope. Unlike everything else, this one had already been opened. He carefully removed a single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the page. The color drained from his face.
What is it?
I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly handed the paper to me. It wasn't a letter. It was a printed change of address request. Official postal service paperwork. My stomach tightened. The forwarding address listed wasn't Olivia's. It wasn't Michael's house. It wasn't any address I recognized. The request claimed that all correspondence addressed to Olivia Bennett should be temporarily redirected. Temporary. The effective date, 14 years earlier. The signature at the bottom was almost impossible to read. Almost. I stared at it for several long seconds. It certainly wasn't mine. It didn't resemble Michael's handwriting either. Rachel leaned closer. Lie. Can you tell whose signature that is? I looked again. No. Michael rubbed both hands across his face. I've never filled out one of those forms. I haven't either, Rachel said immediately. For the first time since arriving, I believed her. There was something about her reaction that couldn't be faked. She looked just as confused as the rest of us. I placed the form back inside the envelope. Where exactly was this box? Rachel pointed upward. Behind a loose section of plywood near the back corner. Could someone have hidden it there years ago, I suppose? Michael stood and began pacing slowly across the room. My parents helped us move into this house. So did Carol. Frank was there. A lot of people were. He stopped walking. If someone wanted to hide something, no one would have noticed. I finished. Silence settled over the dining room. Everything I thought I understood had shifted once again. At the warehouse, the evidence pointed toward someone deliberately keeping my letters from Olivia. Now another hidden collection suggested the problem had reached far beyond me. Other birthday cards, other family members, other missing memories. This wasn't simply about a grandfather. Someone had been quietly controlling which pieces of family ever reached Olivia. But one question had become impossible to ignore. If Rachel hadn't hidden the letters, then who had? Looked from Michael to Rachel and back again. For the first time in years, none of us seemed certain of anything. The box on the table had turned all of our assumptions upside down. I had walked into the house expecting answers. Instead, I'd found another layer of the mystery, one that reached far beyond my own letters. I think we need to slow down, I said quietly. Michael stopped pacing. Slow down? We've spent the last 15 years believing things without proof. Not making that mistake again. Rachel nodded, almost gratefully. I agree. She reached into the box once more, carefully lifting out another stack of photographs. As she spread them across the table, something caught my attention. The pictures weren't random. Someone had arranged them in order, almost like pages in a scrapbook that had never been finished. There was Olivia learning to ride her bicycle, Olivia holding a blue ribbon after a school science fair, Olivia standing beside a Christmas tree with a smile that reminded me more of Helen than ever. I wasn't in a single photograph. Neither's Carol, neither was Frank. It was as though half of Olivia's family had quietly disappeared from history. Michael noticed it too. I've never realized that. What? There are almost no pictures of Dad's side of the family after Olivia turned 5. Rachel looked surprised. I never thought about it either. Michael frowned. That doesn't make sense. No, I answered. It doesn't. He walked toward a cabinet in the dining room and returned carrying 3 old family albums. We've had these since we moved into this house. Together, we began turning the pages. The first album covered Olivia's first 4 years. Birthday parties, family barbecues, Christmas mornings. There I was holding her on my shoulders. Carol was laughing beside Helen. Frank was grilling hamburgers in the backyard. Everyone was together. Then we opened the second album. Almost overnight, everything changed. The photographs became smaller, fewer family gatherings, mostly school events and vacations. Rachel's parents appeared often, her cousins, her sisters. But my side of the family slowly vanished. Not because we had argued, had died. We simply disappeared. Michael stared at the pages in disbelief. I've looked through these albums dozens of times. And never noticed, I said. He slowly nodded. I guess because it happened gradually. Sometimes the biggest changes happen so slowly that no one notices until they're looking backward. Rachel suddenly stood. Wait. She hurried upstairs. A minute later, she returned carrying a laptop. I think I know where the old computer backups are. She searched quietly for several moments before opening a folder labeled Family Archive. Thousands of digital photographs appeared. She sorted them by year. The pattern became even clearer. The family wasn't separated by one dramatic event. It happened little by little, fewer invitations, fewer visits, fewer holidays together, until, eventually, there were none. Michael leaned back heavily in his chair. I let this happen? No, I replied gently. You were busy working. I should have noticed. I should have asked why Olivia stopped talking about you. He looked at me with tears beginning to gather in his eyes. I honestly believed. I thought maybe you just wanted space. I gave a small, sad smile. I thought you wanted space too. The room fell silent again. How many families had drifted apart simply because nobody asked one difficult question? Rachel quietly closed the laptop. I need to tell you something. Neither of us interrupted. Olivia was little. Every now and then she'd ask why Grandpa Arthur didn't visit anymore. I looked at her. What did you tell her? Rachel's eyes filled with tears. I told her you were probably busy. She swallowed. That's what I believed. Michael looked at her in surprise. You never told me that. I was embarrassed. Why? Because every time she asked, I realized I didn't actually know the answer. She covered her face for a moment before continuing. I thought maybe your father was angry with us. I slowly shook my head. I never stopped waiting for someone to call. Rachel looked genuinely heartbroken. I'm so sorry. The apology felt sincere. It also raised another impossible question. If Rachel hadn't created the distance, who had benefited from it? Before anyone could speak again, the doorbell rang. Michael frowned. We're not expecting anyone. He walked to the front door. A moment later, I heard a familiar voice. Evening. Carol. She stepped inside, carrying a large canvas tote bag. When she saw me sitting at the dining room table, she stopped. I had a feeling you'd be here. Michael looked puzzled. You knew? She nodded slowly. I suspected. Rachel gestured toward the table. We found another box. Carol's eyes immediately dropped to the unopened birthday cards. For several long seconds, she didn't move. Then she quietly set her bag on the floor. I was hoping these would never have to be found. Every head in the room turned toward her. Michael spoke first. Aunt Carol. What do you mean? She took a slow breath before answering. I didn't know where they were, but I knew they existed. My heart pounded. You knew? She nodded. Not at first. Then when? About 12 years ago. The room became perfectly still. Carol looked directly at me. I tried to tell someone. Who? She hesitated. I went to Daniel Mercer. My mind immediately returned to the signature on the storage box. He was trying to help? She nodded, tears running freely now. He discovered something was terribly wrong with the mail. Then why didn't he tell me? He wanted proof first. Michael stared at her. Proof of what? Carol closed her eyes. Proof that someone inside the system kept changing Olivia's mailing records. I felt my pulse quicken. Who? Carol slowly shook her head. Daniel never got that far. What happened? He became seriously ill before he could finish investigating. The room remained silent. He told me one thing before he died. She reached into her tote bag and carefully removed an old sealed envelope. I've carried this for 3 years because I didn't know what to do with it. She placed it gently in front of me. Written across the front, in Daniel Mercer's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words that made every person at the table stop breathing. Arthur, don't blame your family until you read this. I stared at Daniel Mercer's handwriting until the words began to blur. Arthur, don't blame your family until you read this. For several seconds, no one moved. The room was so quiet I could hear the old wall clock in the hallway marking each passing second. My hands trembled as I slid a finger beneath the brittle flap. The envelope had already been opened once, years ago, but Carol had carefully tucked the letter back inside. I unfolded the paper with the same care I used to give fragile letters during my years with the Postal Service. Daniel's handwriting was steady, though weaker than I remembered. Arthur, if you're reading this, then I either found the truth too late or never had the chance to tell you myself. I discovered irregular forwarding requests connected to Olivia Bennett's mail. At first, I believed it was a filing mistake. Then I found multiple requests submitted under different signatures but using the same customer account. Someone was exploiting an old computer error that allowed unauthorized address changes to remain active without triggering an audit. I paused, hardly breathing. I investigated quietly because I feared accusing the wrong person. The evidence suggested the requests originated from inside the system, not from your family. Before I could identify the employee responsible, I became ill. I archived every recovered letter I could find instead of destroying them. I hoped one day someone honest would finish what I started. If that day comes, remember this. Your son did not submit the requests. Your daughter-in-law did not submit the requests. And your granddaughter never rejected your letters. They were victims, too. The final paragraph was shorter. Don't let missing years become missing forgiveness. That was all. No dramatic confession. No hidden villain waiting in the shadows. Just the truth. I lowered the letter onto the table and quietly wiped my eyes. For 15 years, I had carried a weight none of us deserved. Michael slowly picked up the letter and read it himself. By the time he reached the final line, tears were running freely down his face. I'm sorry, he whispered. I looked at my son. What are you apologizing for? I stopped asking questions. So did I. He shook his head. I should have driven over to your house. I should have sat at your kitchen table and asked why everything felt different. I smiled sadly, and I should have come to yours. We had both waited for the other to take the first step. 15 years had disappeared inside that silence. Rachel reached across the table and gently placed her hand over mine. I blamed you. I know. I thought you chose to leave our lives. I thought you wanted me gone, she quietly cried. I'm sorry. I believe you. Luckby. For the first time since Helen passed away, I felt something inside me finally loosen. Not because every answer had been found, but because the hardest question had. Olivia had never stopped loving a grandfather she barely remembered. She had simply never been given the chance to know him. A soft voice came from the doorway. Mom? We all turned. Olivia stood there, still wearing her school backpack. Loy. She looked from one tearful face to another before noticing the letters spread across the dining room table. What's going on? Nobody answered immediately. Michael slowly stood. Sweetheart, come here. She walked into the room cautiously. Her eyes settled on one envelope. Her name was written across the front in my handwriting. She picked it up carefully. Who's this from? I swallowed. I wrote that. You did? For your 8th birthday. She looked at the unopened seal. Never got it. No. She reached for another, then another, then another. There seemed to be no end to them. These are all for you, I said quietly. Her hands began to shake. There are so many. I wrote every birthday. She stared at me with tears filling her eyes. You never stopped? Never. The room disappeared around us. There were no accusations anymore, no arguments, only years that neither of us had been allowed to live. Olivia slowly crossed the room until she stood directly in front of me. I thought she couldn't finish. I understood. Anyway, you thought I forgot you. She nodded. I waited too, her face crumpled. Without another word, she wrapped her arms around me. It wasn't the careful, polite hug she'd given me at her birthday party. It was the hug of a granddaughter who had just found 15 years she believed had never existed. I held her as tightly as I dared. Neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. Some truths speak loudest in silence. Over the following weeks, the Postal Service completed its internal review. Daniel had been right. A software flaw in an outdated forwarding system had allowed unauthorized changes to remain active for years after they should have expired. The employee responsible had retired long before the problem was discovered, and there was no evidence that anyone in my family had ever requested the changes. The investigation couldn't give us back birthdays, Christmas mornings, school plays, or ordinary afternoons together, but it gave us something we had almost lost forever: truth. Olivia asked if she could take the letters home. Not all at once, she said with a small smile. I want to read one every night, I laughed. That'll keep you busy. I've got 15 years to catch up. A few days later, she came to my house carrying the cherry wood jewelry box. I finally opened it. You like it? She smiled through happy tears. It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received. She placed the silver compass around her neck. It fits perfectly. I'm glad. She looked around my workshop with wide eyes. Did you really make all this? I did. Will you teach me? No one had asked me that in years. I'd love to. That spring became the beginning of something neither of us expected. Every Saturday morning, she came over with coffee for me and hot chocolate for herself. I taught her how to measure wood before making the first cut, how to sand with patience instead of force, and how every small mistake could become part of something beautiful if you refused to quit too early. One afternoon, she noticed Helen's photograph beside the workshop window. I wish I'd known Grandma better, I smiled. I think you will. She looked confused. How? I pointed toward the shelves. Every story I never got to tell you. We've got time now. And we did. The years that were stolen could never be returned, but they no longer controlled the years ahead. Sometimes people ask me if I regret opening that envelope from Daniel Mercer. The answer is no. Painful truth is still kinder than a comfortable lie, because one letter didn't simply clear my family's name. It gave me my granddaughter back. These days, when the mail truck stops in front of my house, I still walk down the driveway out of habit. Only now there's usually another envelope waiting for me. The handwriting is different from mine. A little less careful, a little more youthful, but every Sunday, without fail, Olivia sends me a handwritten letter, even though she could text me in seconds. She says some things are too important to trust to a screen. Everyone ends exactly the same way. Love always, Grandpa's girl. And every time I fold that letter closed, I think about something Helen whispered to me years ago while the evening sun disappeared behind our maple trees. Never stop trying. Sometimes love arrives late, but when it finally finds its way home, like it is still right on time.